In this lecture, I want to cover how markets operate and the various factors that affect supply and demand. A market is just a place where buyers and sellers come together. It can be online, it can be on the phone, it can be an actual place, but it's just a place where buyers and sellers get together. And the reason that markets are of interest is they process information really quickly in most cases. Um, and so I guess the best way to think of them is to think of them as information processing units. They're subject to a lot of institutional demands to make them work, but they're pretty amazing in the way that they can come up with, in many cases, a unique price. And that is the focal point of market analysis, is that unique price that comes out of well-functioning markets anyways. And that price gives us a lot of information. It links one good with all the other goods out there that have a price tag on them. So if this shirt costs $28 and a cup of coffee costs $2, then essentially that cup of coffee is worth 1/14 of a shirt. And so it's really a way to link the values of one good to another that's out there. And it tells us which things are scarce and which things are abundant. It gives us a whole bunch of information. And I'm always sort of amazed when I think about just how much information is contained in a singular price that's out there for any good. So what we're going to cover in this, I'm going to use a consistent example while I go through this. We'll go through a bunch of other examples later on, but I'm just going to use the demand for Chilean guided tours. And again, a market, just to cover what we're going to be going through. A market is simply a place where buyers and sellers get together and try to haggle over price in some respects. We'll cover what they do. Again, it's that processing that information that's out there. We'll cover the concept of demand, the willingness and ability to purchase something. We'll make probably the most important distinction between quantity demanded and demand. I know it's a linguistic thing that's in every textbook that's out there, but it's really an important one. I would say that in having taught for 25 years or so, the number one stumbling block for students is that they don't get this distinction between quantity demanded and demand. Demand is a relationship. The quantity demanded is an outcome. And I'll go through that as we begin this. Then I want to look at things that change that relationship or shifts in demand. Then I'll look at the factors that do that. And then I'll look at supply. And I'll make the same distinction on supply as I did on demand between quantity supplied and supply. I'll look at those shifts in supply and the factors that do that. And then I'll bring this together in the concept of equilibrium. Under ordinary circumstances, you can get a unique equilibrium as long as demand curves are downward sloping and supply curves are upward sloping. It means that producers and consumers have a different reaction to price changes. As long as that's the case, you can get a unique equilibrium. It might take a while, might not happen over a long period of time, but at least there's the possibility there when you have that circumstances. And then we'll do something called comparative statics, which is looking at changes in equilibrium positions, okay? So let's start out with the demand relationship. Again, this is the willingness and ability to purchase something. I like to think that if you're sitting outside a pizza place and you are hungry, but you have no cash in your wallet, then you don't have any demand, because it's not just a need or anything like that. It has to be that you're willing, that you want to purchase it, and that you're able to purchase it at the same time. They both have to come into play. I might have plenty of cash in my pocket, but I'm never going to have any demand for lime green leisure suits. They're just out of my realm of possibility in there. So a demand is a relationship between the price of something and the quantity that you're willing and able to purchase on it. So again, this is that distinction between demand and quantity demanded. So we have different prices over here: 12,000, 10,000, 8,000, 6,000, 4,000, 2,000. Then we have different quantities. This is per month, if you're looking at this, of these sales, and in hundreds. And so you have this relationship between these prices and these quantities that people are willing and able to purchase on that. So it's the quantity demanded along the horizontal axis, and it's the prices along the vertical axis. And the relationship between the two is demand. And that's the real key that we're looking at here, is that demand is a relationship. I'm really emphasizing this because this is the #1 place that people have a problem when they're learning supply and demand. After this, it's pretty simple. I think the key for some of the things in this class are going to be, deal with the complexity. But with supply and demand, I think straightforward is better. That I'm going to try to simplify this as much as I can, because I think that a lot of problems actually come from overthinking it. It's really a framework that is about simplicity. And that's where its beauty comes in some respects on that. So if we look at this at different prices, we have different quantities that individuals would want to demand of this product, the guided Chilean tours on this. So for instance, at 10,000, there would be 200 per hour. I'm sorry, 200 per month. And then at 2,000, there would be 1,000 a month that's on that. Essentially, these are all in hundreds that are out there. So when we're looking at this, one of the first things to note is that you have prices on one axis, quantity demanded on the other axis, and the demand is actually the relationship between these two. And so as you change price, so you go from 10,000 down to 4,000, you change quantity demanded, but you don't change demand. Okay, that's the key distinction. Demand doesn't change, it's that relationship, it's that blue line on there, but you do change the quantity demanded as you change price. And you can see that sort of recapped in the table over there. Above it is this term ceteris paribus. I'm going to come back to this later on, but just to say it, every now and then economists like to whip a little Latin. This just means all else equal. But what it really means is focus, focus, focus. Don't try to go thinking about all the other things that could happen in a question. Just focus on what the question is asking. I think that's the best way to explain that. So again, what we're looking at here, we have an inverse relationship. We usually think that individuals will want and be able to purchase less of something as the price goes up. This is really for two reasons. They're known as the income and substitution effects. On the income side, simply if you're buying a bunch of goods and their prices go up, if you think about your available, how far your wealth will go, it simply goes down because you can't purchase as much of everything once the price of a good goes up like this. You actually have less real income or real wealth at that point because everything's gotten more costly. So you purchase less of all sorts of goods that are out there. But there's also a substitution effect that when the price of a good goes up, people will also see it as relatively more expensive than other goods that are out there. So if you're making a choice between Chilean tours or Peruvian tours, when the price of Chilean tours goes up, it's suddenly, relatively speaking, Peruvian tours have gotten cheaper. Okay, so that's the income and substitution effects, and we generally think of demand curves as being downward sloping. There's obviously some exceptions to this where higher prices will entice more people to purchase it. It's a little bit irrational, but it will happen at certain times. I know that when the Infiniti was first introduced, they introduced it as a compact car, and it didn't sell particularly good, but they pulled it from the market, added lots of bells and whistles, jacked up its price, and sold it as a luxury car, and it sold much better. Now it had more features to it, but essentially you would look at this as a case where a higher price actually enticed more people on that. So again, we want to make the distinction between changes in demand and changes in quantity demanded. This is a case in which if we increase the price, we're going to see the quantity demanded decrease. So, and this is called a movement along the demand curve. There was no change in demand, There was simply a decrease in the quantity demanded because of the increase in price. That's the case on this. Anytime you have a change, and I'm going to state this kind of strangely, but I think it's the most correct way to state it. Anytime you have a change in the price of the good whose market that you're looking at, you're just going to get a movement along the demand curve, and when we get to it, a movement along the supply curve, but no change in supply or demand. That has to be something else. It might be the price of another good or some other shift that's going to, or factor that kicks in, but it won't be the price of the good whose market that we're looking at. In this case, the price of guided Chilean tours. Okay. So a shift comes when you actually, a change in demand comes when you actually shift the curve. What's happening there is if you increase demand, the demand curve is going to shift to the right. And if you decrease demand, the demand curve is going to shift to the left. Don't think up or down, think left and right. Left for decreases, right for increases. This will help you when you're learning supply because it's sometimes confusing if you do up or down. Just think right, increase, left, decrease. And what this is showing, when you have an increase in demand, it means at any given price, you now are willing and able to purchase more of that good. This is about Chilean guided tours. It would be perhaps that suddenly Chile becomes the new hotspot. And so everybody wants to go down there. There's a change in tastes. And so that increases demand. That means no matter what price they're charging, they're probably going to get more people who want to purchase these guided tours up there. The example I really like to use is if you think about a pizza place and suddenly they offer free beer. And so that's going to get everybody into the pizza place. Suddenly at any given price of pizza, you're going to see an increased quantity demanded for that. So whether it's at $2 or $4 or $5 per hour, or $5 for a pizza, you're going to see this, people want to buy more. And so it shifts the whole relationship. That's the key there. Okay. Now there are a number of factors that shift the demand curve. And so remember, shifts to the right are increases and shifts to the left are decreases. Now, I'm going to go through these various shifts, but I do think that the best way to approach this is, since all of us are consumers, to put yourself in the position of a typical consumer. And I guess unless you're really strange, this should work. That if it's something that would make you want to buy more of it at any given price, that's an increase in demand, a shift to the right. If it's something that would make you want to buy less of it at any given price, this is a shift to the left. Okay, and just ask you that question. Ask yourself that question on any problem that you might be given, and you don't have to remember all this because this will all fit in place. But sometimes it helps to have some types of things when you're going through this, and so both Krugman and Wells and myself will go through this. So first of all, income has a big effect on this. That if your income goes up, in most cases, people will buy more of a good. And if your income goes down, people will buy less of a good, all things being equal on that. The ceteris paribus comment on that. So for instance, if there's a recession, something like Chilean guided tours will probably take a huge hit. It's not a necessity. It's something that people sort of purchase out of their disposable income. And so if people have less income, we're likely to see the demand for those decrease. Well, that'll be a shift to the left. There are some goods that are kind of strange on this. So we make a distinction between normal and inferior goods. You'll see that right under the recession there. A normal good is one in which your income goes up, you buy more of it. Inferior good is one in which your income goes up, you buy less of it. So most goods are in the normal category. There's even some gradations of these categories that I'll talk about in a minute. But if we think about a normal good, for instance, I think for the most part, gasoline's a normal good. That if your income goes up, you're probably going to drive more and you're going to use more gasoline on that. So that would be a shift to the right that would take place in the relationship. Inferior goods, the big one for me was ramen noodles. That when I was in college, I ate ramen noodles, and as soon as my income got up, I never ate these things again. So my income went up, and I ate less ramen noodles that are out there. But there's all sorts of things like that. As your income goes up, you consume less of them that are out there. Those are inferior goods. There's also sort of very extreme versions of normal and inferior goods. So there's something called a superior good, which is one in which your income goes up, you consume more of it. So I would think, or I should state that even more specifically, as your income goes up, you not only consume more of it, but it takes up an increasing component of your budget. So I would think personal jets are something like this. And then there's a strange instance of an inferior good in which as your income, the price of this good goes up, you actually see yourself, even though it's an inferior good, you actually see yourself consuming more of it. This is called a Giffen good, and it's something that often takes up a huge amount of your budget. And so what happens is that income effect dominates over any substitution effects that are in there. So the classic one were potatoes during the Irish famine, that they were a huge component of people's budgets. When the price went up of them, even though they would normally switch away from potatoes to other goods, they ended up actually consuming more of them because it was the only thing they could afford. That's sort of a disastrous situation. But the key distinction is between normal and inferior goods. Later on, we'll talk a little bit about elasticity, and we'll be able to sort of look at the income elasticity for various goods that are out there. That's something you want to check. And if you're thinking about your own products or services, it's often good to figure out whether they're normal goods, which I think most outdoor goods would be, but there might be some exceptions, and inferior goods, because it'll matter as to how you're going to price these things based on income changes. So that's income. We also have the prices of other goods that matter. On the consumption side, we think about substitutes as things that we consume either one or the other. So I mentioned Peruvian tours before, that you're in any given month, you're probably not going to go on both a very expensive Peruvian tour or a Chilean tour. So to a certain extent, they're substitutes for each other. So the way this works is that if the price of a substitute goes up, then we're going to see demand for your product increase. So in other words, if the price of the Peruvian tours goes up, then we're going to see more people go on the Chilean tours. They're going to demand more Chilean tours because, relatively speaking, they're less expensive at that point. So those are substitutes. You consume one or the other. I often think here in Gunnison that skiing at Monarch and skiing at Crested Butte, even though some people will only go to one or the other, that if the prices get too extreme in their differences, then we'll see people shift from going to Crested Butte to Monarch. So if ski pass is doubled or something like that, you'd see some people go to Crested Butte, stop going there, and then go to Monarch to ski. They may try to ski at both, but that's probably not going to do it in one day. That's a lot of driving. So those are substitutes, either or. Usually tea or coffee, that's another example. There's lots of them out there. And then there's complements. These are consumed together. So usually consuming one means you're going to consume the other. Milk and coffee is one example. If we're thinking about Chilean guided tours, we're often thinking about the plane fares as a complement. So if the price of plane fares down in Latin America increases dramatically, that's going to have a negative effect on people's willingness and ability to purchase those guided tours in Chile. And so when the price of a complement goes up, demand for the other good goes down, and vice versa. Okay, so those are prices of other goods. Those come into play in terms of thinking about things that are going to shift demand. Now, there's also tastes, and so tastes change rather dramatically. And so you'll see this is particularly true in the fashion area. About 7 years ago, something I hadn't seen since my sister wore them suddenly came back, and that was elephant pants. So suddenly you saw an increase in elephant pants that was just because taste change. Now, taste might be marketing recreated. That's something you'll have to ask Dr. Borden or Dr. Watson on, but it can have effect on that. In this case, I'm thinking with Chilean guided tours, I'm thinking about if there's an increase in sort of desire to have Chilean wines, or it becomes the hot new wine, then what you're looking at is that will increase travel to Chile, and probably increase the demand for these guided tours, particularly if they design these tours around the wine producing regions that are out there. So that'll increase demand, it'll shift it to the right. Expectations come into play. And so if I'm thinking about doing this trip this year and I'm sort of hedging when I'm going to do it, if there's an expected appreciation of the peso, appreciation of a currency means that it gets stronger. And if we're thinking as Americans of thinking about going down there, and their currency is getting stronger, it means that the peso purchases more dollars than it did previously. Or we can think of the dollar as purchasing less pesos than previous. So when we're looking at this, this would mean that it would be more costly to go down. So maybe if I'm thinking about this tour today, and I know there's going to be an appreciation in a year, maybe because there has less inflation than us or some other factor that's out there, then I'm going to be more likely to book the trip this year. It's going to increase the demand this year because the expectation of the higher cost next year. Expectations come into play all the time. In this course, I want us to think a lot about expectations, because when we get into the macroeconomic side of things, expectations are really key for all sorts of things. We already saw that a little bit when we were thinking about the circular flow model. Confidence is a kind of expectation of things that are out there. So again, in this case, maybe if there's some other expectation, maybe if there's an expectation of a future tax or something like that, all of this is going to affect my behavior in thinking about whether or not to go on these guided tours that are out there. Okay. Now, we can also have government intervention into the market, and later on I'll talk about price ceilings and floors, but one type is taxes and subsidies. A tax is a charge that's put on someone for doing something or purchasing something. A subsidy is a payment to that consumer for doing something or purchasing something that's out there. So these can be put on the consumer or the producer. When they're put on the consumer, that's going to affect the demand curve. And when they're put on the producer, it's going to affect the supply curve. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about ones put on the consumer. And so if you put a tax on a consumer, now the consumer is probably going to end up paying more, but the way to think about this is if something's being priced and you're taxing the consumer, it'll be above that price that you're paying. So suppose I'm thinking I'm going to pay $1,000 for a trip or $2,000 for a trip, but then there's an extra 10% tax on it. That means that I'm going to actually be paying more. So at a price of $2,000, I'm going to be less willing to purchase it because there's an extra cost in addition to the price that I'm going to pay for this guided tour. So if there's a luxury tax on guided tours on consumers, that's going to decrease demand for these guided tours. Okay. Again, one trickiness here is that you, as a consumer, you might be thinking, well, I'm paying more for this, but part of that is the price of the product and part of that is the tax. So when you put the tax on it, it's actually going to decrease demand because you're now actually paying more for any given price that's out there. Okay, so a tax on a tour on the consumer will decrease demand. On the Subsidy side, we can think of a government coupon program that's promoting tourism. Maybe it allows you to do all sorts of things. Maybe if you get a guided tour, it opens up the possibility of doing all sorts of other things for free. Well, that's a payment for doing something. It's going to make you more likely to do it. So a subsidy to the consumer is going to increase demand. Okay? Now, just simply if there's more consumers, either if there's more people traveling, just in general, all of this is going to increase the demand for guided tours. I think in Gunnison, our summers, there's a lot more people around here than during the winters, and so there's just a lot more consumers. So for almost everything, the increase in consumers increases the demand for almost every product, except for skiing, of course, in the summer on that. Okay, so those are all shift factors in demand. Okay, now let's move to the supply side. So Krugman goes all through this. He's pretty good at explaining this, so you might want to read his exposition on this as well. I think he explains this rather well through this period. But if we think on the supply side, we think of an upward sloping relationship or a direct relationship where as you increase the price, that firms want to produce more of the product. So the quantity supplied increases as the price goes up. Again, on the horizontal axis is the quantity supplied, and on the vertical axis is the price of the good. And the supply relationship, or the supply curve, is a relationship between those prices and the quantities supplied. So as you change the price, you don't get a change in supply, you get a change in the quantity supplied. Okay, the supply relationship stays the same unless some other factor changes. So again, we normally think this is an upward sloping relationship. That's not always the case. Like on the demand side, there are some instances where we actually have downward sloping supply curves, particularly in monopolized industries and in some other cases that are out there. But we think of this as the norm relationship that's out there for two reasons. One, it's more profitable for a single firm to produce more at higher pricings of the goods, but it's also going to attract other firms into the industry as the price goes up because the whole industry gets more profitable. So we'll have more quantity supplied as the price goes up. Okay, so that's the supply curve. And just as with the demand curve, a change in the price results in a movement along the supply curve, but no change in supply. As long as it's the price of the good whose market that we're looking at, and we're still looking at guided Chilean tours, that the increase in price just causes an increase in the quantity supplied of these, but no change in supply. Changes in supply happen because the entire relationship changes. An increase in supply means that at any given price, firms are now willing to produce more. A decrease in supply, which is a shift to the left in this, means that at any given price, firms are willing to produce less. Okay. Now, increases in supply usually occur because a firm's costs have gone down or their profitability is increased. Decreases in supply occur because costs have gone up or firms' profitability has decreased, or there's a lot of firms leaving the industry. Now, just as a recap, increases are to the right, decreases are to the left. Okay, don't think up or down, especially on the supply side, that'll get you into trouble. In fact, an increase is actually a shifting down on the curve. So think shift right for both supply and demand is an increase, and shift left is a decrease for both supply and demand. Okay, so there, as with on the demand side, on the supply side, there are a whole bunch of factors that shift the supply curve. Prices of inputs used in the production of a good. So if wages of guides go up, this is going to be a cost to the firms. It's going to raise their costs, and we should see a decrease in supply taking place. If you have something that lowers input costs, that's going to increase the supply, a shift to the right that takes place. Technology is also a factor. If we're thinking about guided tours again, if there's improved travel infrastructure, suppose the government does some infrastructure improvements, This is going to probably improve firm profitability and lower their costs as it's easier to get around. And so this will increase the supply. If for some reason the technology gets worse or it isn't appropriate technology, this would decrease the supply. Suppliers' expectations come into play. Outside of the example we're using, I always think that having worked at a fast food restaurant when I was 16 years old, right away you know what happens when a bus drives into the parking lot. That changes the supplier's expectations, and they start throwing fries around down the fryer later in the fry bin, and you start seeing burgers thrown down the grill or the fryer later, whichever fast food restaurant you're at. And so they start pumping all this out in expectation of future demand. So that comes into play on that. But in case of the guided tours, we might think there are a lot of UNESCO World Heritage designations in Chile. And if they thought that one of those were going to be come to fruition next year, they would anticipate this and they would increase their ability to supply these guided tours because they would anticipate more demand happening on that. So expectations affect suppliers as well as consumers on that. Taxes and subsidies can be put on producers as well as consumers. So that tourism subsidy that I mentioned before, last time it was a coupon, but they might just simply subsidize the firms, and that would increase supply. Where it's on the consumer, it increases demand. When it's on the producer, it increases supply. Now, they might also put in place a transportation tax, and this would be a tax on the firms, and this would decrease supply that's out there. Now, there can also be production substitutes and complements. These are things, so if it's a substitute, a firm would produce one or the other. So I might think that it would be hard for a firm, it could do both, but it couldn't do both at the same time with the same resources. So at some point, Asian tourism is a substitute for the Chilean or Latin American tourism that we're looking at here. So in that case, if the costs of Asian tourism drop dramatically, they might actually decrease the supply of Latin American, or in this case, Chilean guided tours that are out there. But there are also complements, things that you produce collectively on that. So as part of these guided tours, they might also have a side business in Chilean lodges. And if those became cheaper to produce, or if there was a huge demand for them, all those things might make it so that you produced more guided tours because you now have a complement, something that's produced at the same time or with some of the similar resources on that. And again, if there's just more firms entering the industry, then this should increase the overall supply. So now we have the factors that go into shifting demand and supply. And we've talked a little bit about movements along. So the only thing that causes a movement along either the demand or supply curve is a change in the price of the good whose market that you're looking at. So in this case, guided tours. Everything else will cause either a shift in demand or a shift in supply. Okay, now let's put this all together. So the reason we can come up with a unique equilibrium and sort of the power of markets is when you can come up with these unique equilibrium and prices associated with them is because you have a differential relationship between price and quantity on the supply side and price and quantity on the demand side. That high prices tend to make people have less quantity demanded, but higher quantity supplied. And lower prices tend to decrease the quantity supplied and increase the quantity demanded. In cases where you have demand curves upward sloping or supply curves downward sloping for a variety of reasons, then this often doesn't work out, and so you won't have a unique equilibrium. It also should be said that equilibrium is a reference point. I like to explain this as this is based on Newtonian mechanics. That's where the model came from. This was from Alfred Marshall's book in the 1870s. And the idea, if you think about, I think equilibrium is best thought about as if you throw a marble in the bowl, you know where it's going to end up. It's going to end up down at the bottom of the bowl because of gravity. But it may not if the bowl is continually shaken, if there are other forces in play. And also, depending on the size of the bowl and depending on how stable it is and all those sorts of things, it might take almost no time whatsoever to get to the bottom of the bowl. In other words, get to equilibrium, or it might take a whole bunch of time and maybe it never gets there. You have to think of markets this way. Some clear almost instantaneously. The market for various currencies, since we have somewhere between 3 and 5 trillion dollar values of currency trading on any given day that's out there, these are vast amounts of transactions that take place, that they process information instantaneously, and so they get to equilibrium pretty quickly in those particular markets that are out there. But in some markets, I know some people whose PhDs took them over a decade to get, that those can be pretty slow markets. If you think about the market for the number of airplanes out there, that it's quite a long time between the development of a new model of an airplane and when it reaches its minimum efficient scale. It's sometimes a couple decades on that. And so those might never be in equilibrium. Because it takes a long time for the adjustment to take place. The way markets work is they send feedback. So when the price is higher, it should make it so consumers don't want to buy as much and producers want to produce more. But it all depends on how quickly those agents can react to those price changes that are out there and what else is going on. If there's constant changes taking place in a market, that you might keep moving towards the market, but never towards equilibrium, but never actually reach that equilibrium. So I like to think of it as a reference point, a place where the market is headed towards. And it happens where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, because there's no pressure to move away from that point unless some other change occurs. So in our instance here, we're looking at it as $8,000. At that point, the quantity demanded is just equal to the quantity supplied. It's sometimes best to think about equilibrium by thinking about being out of equilibrium. So in this case, if the price is at $10,000 here, if you follow that over to the demand curve and follow that down, you'll see that the quantity demanded is 4, actually 400 in the way I've defined it, but we'll just say 4 for right now. And if you go over to the supply curve, you'll see at that price, the quantity supplied is 10. So at this point, we have a bigger quantity supplied than we have quantity demanded. And so this is how markets work and why they're very good at getting rid of surpluses and shortages. Surplus is when there's more out there than people want to buy, and a shortage is when there's not enough out there for the available buyers, okay? So when I talked about earlier, there was a shortage of liquidity last week that caused a problem in the markets that are out there. And that's because there were more buyers of liquidity, in this case, these repos, than there were sellers, okay? Now in this market, what we're looking at, if it's at $10,000, then we have more TORs that want to be, that are being produced and available than consumers want to buy. And so that's costly to firms to have a surplus. In this case, they're employing their guides, but they're not actually generating revenue in any sense that's out there. So it's costly for them. They might have all sorts of TORs and things that are paid for ahead of time, and if they don't have buyers for them, they're going to cost the firm a lot. So the firm wants to sell this out, so they will probably start lowering their prices in seeing that there's a surplus out there. As they lower their prices, as we move down from 10,000, we'll start to move along that demand curve to a higher quantity demanded. So as it goes down, it'll move from 4 to 5 to 6. And on the supply side, we're looking at some firms, or even one firm, will start to decide that those TORs aren't worth producing anymore. And so we'll see the quantity supplied start to diminish. And so as this happens, quantity demanded will increase and quantity supplied will decrease until you just get to that 7 where they're equated in this case. Now, this is the key to markets. This is what they do, is that when the price is above the one that is producing equilibrium, there are some forces that'll put some downward pressure on prices. And when the price is below, as we'll see, there are some forces that will push the price up. And so this is what they're good at. They're good at getting rid of surpluses and shortages. So let's go to the other side when the price is too low. And in this case, if you follow this across again, follow at 6,000, follow it across the supply curve, you get the quantity supplied of 4. And then if you follow it across to the demand curve, you get the quantity demanded of 10. In this case, there's more people that want to buy these tours than there are tours available from the firms that are producing them. So this is a shortage. And again, either consumers will start bargaining them up or firms will start to notice, hey, I can sell these things and charge a higher price. And so the price will start up. And as it does, the quantity supplied will start to increase. And it'll start making it so that some consumers who wanted to buy it at 6,000 won't want to buy it at 7,000 or 7,500. And so the quantity demanded will start to decrease, the quantity supplied will go up until you just reach that 7 again, where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. That's the equilibrium price and quantity at that point. This is what markets do well. In most of the former planned economies, one of the things when they started to marketize is almost all of them saw massive inflation. Why? Because there were shortages across the economy. And so when they opened up to market forces, the first thing the market tried to do, not to personify it, but the first thing that markets started to do was the prices started to go up. So almost all of them faced hyperinflation in one sort or another. In Poland, in the Czech Republic, and most of them you saw this happen on that. Okay, so this is what equilibrium looks like, a balancing of forces that are out there. It's where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And I just want to reemphasize, some markets get here really quickly and some markets take a long time. This is a reference point. It's out there. And just to recap that process, if you're above, you have forces that bring it down, and if you're below, you have forces that bring it up. Okay. Now, one of the things we do in a lot of the problems I'm going to give you is that we move from one equilibrium position to another. This is often referred to as comparative statics. It's static because you're at an equilibrium point. It's not a dynamic framework, but it's comparative because you're moving from one equilibrium position to another. So when I give you these questions that you'll get on both your assignment and in your in-class assignment, your job is to figure out, given some change, for instance, a change in income, a change in tastes, a change in the prices of other goods, a change in, in input value, in prices, or anything like that, is to figure out what happens to equilibrium from them. You know, where is the new equilibrium once the change occurs? And there are 4 possibilities. There's the first bracket up there in the upper left-hand place, the first graph, I should say, features an increase in supply. And so you can see we started out at point A, and we were at price 1 and quantity 1. And there was something that lowered firms' costs. So if we're thinking of a pizza place, maybe it was that energy costs dropped dramatically. So or there was a better oven comes available or anything like that. And so you get an increase in supply. And the new equilibrium is at the intersection of the new supply curve and the old demand curve. And that's at point B. And what you notice from that is that we've moved from price 1 to price 2. So prices come down. And we've moved from quantity 1 to quantity 2. So quantity has gone up. So when you get an increase in supply, price goes down, quantity goes up. Now the graph next to that is a decrease in supply. This happens because firms' costs go up or their profitability falls, or some other reason. Maybe there's a new tax that was put on this firm or on this industry. And so we started out at point A, where the first supply curve and demand intersect, and that gives you price 1 and quantity 1. And the decrease in supply, which is a shift to the left, you can see we move to point B, the price goes up and the quantity goes down. So the result of that, of a decrease in supply, is that the price goes up, quantity goes down. And if we go to the bottom left graph, we're looking at an increase in demand. In this case, we started out at point A, and that's at price 1 and quantity 1. But in this case, there was an increase in demand. So for the product, maybe there was a subsidy for this product. When we're thinking about education, there's often subsidies for people to go to school of various sorts. And so that increase that takes place here, that would give us our new demand curve, and we'd move to point B at a higher price and a higher quantity. So on the supply side, you notice that the price and quantity go in opposite directions. On the demand side, you notice that they go in the same direction. And the last graph is down at the bottom right, and that is a decrease in demand. Maybe there was a scare from a product. Maybe we suddenly found out that the toys from China were laced with lead, and so this would make people at any given price want to purchase less of it. And so there would be a decrease in demand. We start out at point A, we go to point B, and you see the price, price comes down, and the quantity also comes down. We're starting out in this one. I sort of put that a little bit wrong on there. It's price 2 is where we're starting, and quantity 2, and we go to price 1 and quantity 1 on there. My mistake on there, but you can clarify that on that. Okay, and so in looking at this, we have 4 possibilities, and a lot of the questions you'll have is trying to put things in this framework. Now, one key for those of you who are new to supply and demand, you can sometimes reason through problems and figure out what happens to price and quantity without using the model, because we all have the intuition on this. I would say use the model and draw the graph each time, or at least have the graphs in front of you and think it through. Because this is for 2 reasons. One is you will make mistakes if you just try to intuit each time. And the other issue is that we'll be using some more complex models later on. And I want to get you used to using models. And so work through the model each time rather than trying to intuit around the model. So in other words, think first what happens to demand and supply, then think what happens to price and quantity, rather than just start kind of doing an end run around it of just thinking of price and quantity. Okay, well, that's it for this section of the lecture. I'm going to do a little bit more, but I want to use the whiteboard for that. So I'm going to stop this for now and come back later and do a few more things.